Hi there, and welcome to our Ramadan Conversations. We're all in this together. It's presented by the Affinity Intercultural Foundation of Australia. I'm John Cleary, and I'll be hosting this series of conversations presented throughout Ramadan. Ramadan is, of course, characterised by the iftar meal, the breaking of bread amongst friends and neighbours. And this year, COVID-19 has made that impossible. So Affinity has decided to carry Ramadan to this online platform. Ramadan Conversations is a daily 1 hour live virtual iftar. Each episode will be streamed and later available for download on Affinity's YouTube page. And as a former ABC broadcaster with a special interest in religion, it's my great pleasure to host these conversations together with a number of assistant hosts drawn from the Muslim community. And tonight, we're joined by Makiz Ansari. Makiz is a religion and values teacher at Sydney's Amity College, and she's worked as a research assistant in political economics at the Economics Department of the University of Sydney, and is currently completing her Masters in Islamic Studies at Charles Sturt University. Hi, Makiz. Good to have you back with us.
Hi, John. Good to be back with you.
Makiz, you come from an Afghani background. How do Afghan communities celebrate their Ramadan? I mean, are there any particular distinctives?
I'm not sure if I can recall an true blue Afghan celebration of Ramadan because I was brought up here in Australia, but that is the background, cultural heritage. I think more or less it's similar to many other Muslim communities and cultures. I guess in terms of the breaking of the fast, usually Afghan people love to, and I think it's very similar to other Muslims, start with a light meal, usually soup. Afghans love noodles, so noodles or lentil soup is one of those menu items. They work their way then towards a small break. Usually they pray right after that, like entree, and then they have the sofra with their main course. And they usually like to, like traditionally Muslims, it's a very social point of the year. And so we like to open the fast with usually friends or families. The Ramadan calendar is usually booked at. You have heard that through so many of your guests already. And that's also reflected with the Afghan tradition. And to wrap it all up in terms of the course of meal, Afghans particularly like nuts, dried nuts like walnuts and sultanas and raisins. So they'll have their black or green tea served with nuts and maybe, if it's my home, some biscuits or some cake. And then they carry on the evening through that. So that's more or less similar, but something that my experience of Afghan culture has been.
I'm hungry already. Oh,
we should have you over one day.
Tonight we're off to the United States. And our first two guests are a married couple, Daniel and Bernadette Skubik. Daniel is a retired professor of law, ethics and humanities, who spent some years studying in Australia. And Bernadette has a background in nuclear medicine and radiotherapy at the School of Allied Health at Loma Linda University. They've been married for 45 years and currently live in a veterans retirement community in the high deserts of Southern California. Daniel and Bernadette, it's great to have you with us. And Daniel, perhaps I should first come to you. Daniel, how's COVID affecting you in the high deserts? I mean, tell us a little bit about yourselves and the community where you live. Has it been touched by the pandemic?
We've not been directly touched by the pandemic. There are no cases here in the retirement community, and there are a limited number of cases, single digits, in the local community. The city is Barstow. So we're very fortunate in that regard. But the impact on the community has been significant in that social distancing means there is no personal contact between members in the community, no handshakes, no simple touching, no hugs, which is something that we were all quite used to before the social distancing mandates came down. Also, we're wearing masks whenever we step outside. So not only are we social distancing from each other, the way we normally recognize one another with facial expressions and so on, the simple greeting, it's hard to see a smile behind a mask. So that has had a significant impact on how we relate one to another.
Makiz.
Yeah, well, welcome, Daniel, and thanks for your time. It is very hard to see that smile behind a mask, isn't it? Now,
It is
Daniel,
indeed.
you have come, this virtual world makes life a lot easier in that sense. You spent some years down in Australia, as we call it, down under. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your studies while you were here?
Well, we had the privilege of coming down to Melbourne, the University of Melbourne. While I was in law school, I took out a year to come down to Melbourne to study politics there. That was back in the early 1980s. We fell in love with the country, my wife and I, and we wanted to return as soon as we could. And so a few years later, in 1985, I came down to the Australian National University. I had finished law school. I came down to the university on a fellowship and was able to pick up a PhD program there at the ANU, and then also did a little legal work while I was there and a bit of lecturing while I was there. We had to leave, of course, at the end of the program of study. Students weren't permitted to stay in the country, though I think we would have tried if we could. Came back to the United States for a couple of years and then back to Australia once more to Brisbane and Griffith University in 1980. And we had originally planned on remaining in the country for many years, but in 1993 we were required to return to the United States. So altogether, over that 12-year period, 1982 to 1993, we were in Australia about 7-8 years, and it was a real joy.
Well, look, you're practically, sort of informal citizens of the country under that sort of regime. You trained, Daniel, as an attorney and taught as a professor of law and ethics. Words are in some ways your trade. Semantics and nuance have played a significant role in your professional life. We seem to be living in a time when nuance and shades of meaning have been overthrown by short-term Instagram thinking, where the traditional hierarchy of knowledge based on method and applied rationality has been replaced by anecdotal experience. My thoughts, my experience take pride of place. To what extent is this wave of populist politics also linked to this televisual world? What's it doing to the fabric of social cohesion?
There's an awful lot that you've packed into your questions. Let me try just a response to one angle, and that is to what extent technology and the advance of technology, like this very technology we're using today, has had an impact on self-perception and has had an impact then on our understanding of the role of politics in our lives. On the one hand, technology like this permits a sort of contact that was not possible in the past, to be able to connect with others, to be able, as we are today, to see one another over vast distances, to carry on conversations. And there's at least an illusion that, in fact, we're in the same room face to face. We have shared ideas and perhaps shared ideals and values. And now we're able to speak together without distance separating us. Now transfer that to the area of politics. I may have some very strange ideas. I may have some odd ideas about why the world is running the way it is. Typically, some sort of conspiracy operating in the background. That means someone is a puppet master and pulling strings. And that odd idea may rest with me, and there is little further for it to travel. But now with technology, I can reach out and find those who happen to share some of these beliefs and some of the values that are attached to these beliefs about what sort of action might be taken. Prior to the advent of this sort of technology that allows us to reach out to one another in these ways, I might have sat in my home, whether it's here in a retirement community in the desert, you in Australia, and we would never have crossed paths. But now we can find one another. And not just you and I, but large numbers of individuals can now find one another and discover that, oh, we have these similarities in beliefs and concerns. And now we can work together in ways that would not have been possible before. Why it is that conspiracies and goods travel faster than the truth on technology is difficult for me to understand, and yet study after study after study seems to suggest that that is the case. There's one proverbial or anecdote puts it that falsehood has circled the globe while truth is still putting on its pants. There is no race. And so technology is a double-edged sword in today's world, allowing all sorts of actors to come together and disrupt rather than seek peace.
Yes, I guess the tag on that is it's being exploited for political purposes.
Exploited both by the individual and small groups, and exploited by leaders, those already in leadership positions, particularly elected officials, or those seeking elective office, who can find support amongst fractious elements in society.
Makiz.
It's an interesting point and perspective, Daniel, indeed. And just taking that further beyond technology and the actual reality of some of the places we actually traveled. We hear that you've had the opportunity to travel India with the Smith group. And it is a country, as we know currently, seeing this populism linked to the Hindu nationalism, particularly regarding the Muslims. And but interestingly and ironically, India has been that a country long associated with development of many different traditions: Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Islam, as well as Christianity. Now, religious traditions seem to be turning in on themselves, rejecting democracy, perhaps as secular, under the guise of secular, and identifying authority with tradition. Turkey is another example of that currently going. And I know I've given you two different areas. What are your observations, perhaps, in each one of them, India and Turkey, and the current plight of the civic tensions and the fabric of their societies?
Most certainly in India, which was most recent travel to overseas destination with Hizmet, that was just this past February. In fact, I left the country the day before President Trump arrived for his state visit.
Right.
And in ways, there are strong parallels between India and the United States, both in historical terms and in contemporary terms. Historically, both are lands that have opened their arms to immigrants, opened their arms to diversities of religions, opened their arms to a wide variety of influences from around the world that have made both India and the United States stronger countries. And yet both are experiencing today very strong populist trends grounded, I would say, in fear, grounded in the fear of losing whatever it is that one feels in possession of and most fears losing. And elected officials are playing on those fears and telling the people that they need to be afraid of outsiders, of those would-be enemies who would take away their place, take away their property, take away missions, take away their economic status, take away their religions, take away their values and displace them with others, substitute their beliefs for the beliefs of the people. This sort of fear-mongering that we've seen in India against minority religions now, and the apparent attempt at going so far as to establish a Hindu state rather than a secular state that is welcoming to all religions. But I fear that that's also finding expression in the United States, where what we have, to be frank, is an attempt to see white supremacy reinforced, that immigration is to be downplayed, if not eliminated entirely, that immigrants and those from overseas are to be seen as enemies. And I'm afraid we're seeing something similar in Turkey. I was able to visit a number of times and even to teach during one sabbatical semester at Zirve University in Gaziantep. That university, amongst many other universities, were closed down by the elected leadership because of fear, because perhaps even of envy, but certainly because of fear that there was going to be disruption politically, disruption electorally, that the elected officialdom was not going to tolerate.
Thank you.
You mentioned Hizmet in your as one of the groups that you've been associated with and helped travel with. How did you first get to know Hizmet in the first place, and what do you see of its stated mission to be genuinely intercultural, to build bridges rather than walls, I guess?
We were first introduced to Hizmet back in 2007, so about 13 years ago now. We were at a Ramadan Iftar event in the city of Riverside in Southern California, and some representatives, the organization at the time was called, quite interestingly, Global Cultural Connections. That became Pacifica Institute, which is part of the broader Hizmet movement, those associated with Fethullah Gulen and the teachings of Gulen. Global Cultural Connections was about making those global connections by inviting academics, elected officials, administrators, and others to visit Turkey and then other places around the world where, and I'll call them Hizmet now, where Hizmet had established schools, because there's a great focus on education. The elementary, the primary level, the secondary level, and the university level as well. A number of such schools established literally around the world, not only in Turkey and the United States, but in many of the stands, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and others in Asia, and other countries in the Islamic world and outside the Islamic world. Indeed, there was some schools established in Japan and in Taiwan. And again, there have been schools established well over 100. I believe the number is closer to 200 today around the world. And we've had the opportunity to travel with Hizmet and to visit many of the schools. One thing that's interesting about the schools is that they do not teach religion as a formal academic area of study. They teach mostly the sciences, like the STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. They teach religion, to the extent they teach it at all, through the example of their teachers. These are teachers at these schools who are committed to giving of themselves to the students, not just passing on knowledge, but passing on a way of looking at the world and a way of being in the world. And so they give of themselves. And that's something that we are very much drawn to, that educators give not just knowledge, not just reading, not just cognitive skills, but show a way of living in this world that is inclusive rather than excluding others.
That's so beautifully. Yes, John, that was so beautifully expressed, Daniel, in the role modeling of teachers. And being from an educational background myself, I would hope that as teachers we actually do that, aspire that across the board, actually to be that role model that students are actually inspired by, hopefully. I guess my next question is that with that level of changes and the incredible shift that we see in terms of our social interactions and our lives, as it used to be pre-COVID-19, normality has taken a new definition. And so how do you gauge this new normal on one hand, and what of the old normal must change in your thoughts, Daniel? And what are some of those new norms that you think will be essential to building a post-COVID-19 world of social cohesion? So this new normal versus old normal, what should stay and what should change in your thoughts, Daniel?
From what little I understand of the science, and I am no scientist, simply read in the press what scientists from the Centers for Disease Control and from the World Health Organization and others are saying about COVID, social distancing, wearing of masks, and so on is likely to be with us for quite some time. There's no going back to normal. There's no going back to January and February for us here in the United States, at least for many months, if not years. And so we need to find a new way to relate to the other. While it is marvelous, as we mentioned earlier, to have this technology that allows this sort of contact, even over great distances, like the United States and Australia at this moment. At the same time, we don't want to be lured into an illusion that, in fact, we're carrying on a conversation face to face. I see you and you see me, but we're not really together. We miss that intimate contact when bodies are in the same room and not just sharing screenshots. I'm not sure what the new normal can look like, but we do need to construct new forms of intimacy. And that in much of our lives, we're finding ourselves distanced one from another, and that physical contact, that personal contact, even the sharing of a wink and a smile, is not going to be possible as it used to be. I'm not sure what a reasonable replacement, what a possible replacement might look like. I would be happy to hear any of your thoughts on such matters.
Time will tell, wouldn't
Well,
it? It's evolving
I think
circumstances. Yeah.
I think the one thing we can be sure of is we are all in this together. It's in.
Yes. There was I'm sorry I can't now recall the title of the cartoon strip, but there was a series in our local paper here in the high desert that showed apartment blocks of a large city, unnamed, side by side, with the little bubbles coming out of all the windows of all the apartment blocks of individuals saying to themselves in English or a variety of other languages, I'm all. The point of the strip, of course, being I'm all alone.
I'm all alone. Oh.
The point of the strip, of course, being that we are indeed all in this together, but we are at the same time also feeling quite separated and so all alone, even though we're all together. So constructing some form of being together when we can't physically occupy a space next to one another, I think is going to be a real challenge, perhaps a real opportunity, but the real challenge for us in the near and long-term future.
Daniel, I think that's an appropriate place to segue into your partner, the one you have been together with for over 40 years, and introduce Bernadette to our audience. Daniel, thank you for joining us so much this evening.
Thank you so very much, Makiz, John.
A pleasure, Daniel.
You're with Ramadan Conversations. My co-host today is Makiz Ansari. Makiz, Daniel had a lot to say that was this is the sort of stuff you want to go away and think about. And we're now about to hear from his partner in life, Bernadette Skubik, who has spent her life along the same path, but with her own perspectives. Bernadette, it's going to be great to be able to catch your insights. Perhaps I could ask you first to comment on your career. You come from an area of hard science and applied health, nuclear medicine and radiotherapy. So where did your interest in interfaith dialogue spring from? I mean, how has your background in science been of assistance on this journey?
The perspective in the early years that I experienced in a essentially immigrant community was primarily, since God alone heals, then how much is any sacred vocation that is able to witness the veracity that through our attentiveness, through our scholarship, we will witness God healing. When I met and found those very same sensibility of devotion as a creature of God, creature of our Creator, it was and is for us an awesome blessing to be shared with the entire world, to be offered to the entire world that our healing is at hand. We hope, beyond hope, even in the midst of this crisis. And we have these beautiful Hizmet scholars who recognize that I cherish in my upbringing as a young child in a essentially interfaith neighborhood. And that is, we are being healed through the creation, but it's of the Creator. So there's absolutely no conflict between science and faith. That's more or less a modern episodic, as they call it, information silos.
Makiz.
What? Yes, Bernadette, thank you, and a pleasure to have you. What a heartwarming answer and response that was. It was quite gripping. It gripped me completely. Going on that reconciliation between science and faith you mentioned, along with Daniel, you've actually traveled quite a fair bit and have been exposed to diverse communities and cultures around the world on a number of trips. Now, if you were to highlight one key characteristic, I suppose, or a human quality that perhaps stands out to you as that one common denominator across all of these cultures that you've seen and experienced and witnessed, what would be the most noteworthy of those as a binding point for you across all of these cultures? What would be that human quality, that one characteristic?
We have traveled several places with Hizmet, and in visiting those Hizmet schools, we were finding that the young people are so open to, for example, I think it was in Phnom Penh, how can we serve you? The young people, the Hizmet students, a desire to serve that we have experienced it in every culture wherein we've had the honor of visiting the Hizmet schools, and it's like the young people being honored and being ennobled, really ennobled by looking beyond themselves, seeing the embodiment through their teachers of serving, looking for nothing in return, no strings attached, no secret agenda. And we find that that is a common aspect of these young hearts. And there are no cultural barriers, and there are no barriers between science and faith. They complement one another. The cultures do, the studies, the scholarship, the various disciplines become integrated.
Bernadette, let me pick up on your scientific experience and ask a comment on this. I recall, I had the privilege early in my career working as a broadcaster of being sent to Africa in the early 1980s during the first outbreak of AIDS, the AIDS pandemic, particularly in Zambia and Zimbabwe. I went out into the villages in the African countryside and I encountered a young doctor. And he said to me this, he said, look, whilst there is no medical treatment for AIDS, I have an exercise in community development, not medicine. That is, helping communities to modify their customs and habits to avoid passing on the infection. Now, it seems that this is also true of the current pandemic. Yet some in our community, even our leaders, do not seem to grasp it.
Oh, I think of John Donne constantly. No man is an island. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And if a clod be washed away, Europe is the less for it. There are those here living, and we're senior citizens, baby boomer senior citizens. Now, mind you, we live halfway between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Barstow is a sort of little town where everybody stops, makes a little rest stop, buy their gas, and yet there seems to be a complete incapacity to understand the communal nature of here where we're living. seniors carry the burden of the highest what's called comorbidity. We could quite possibly be the most vulnerable, but also those that pose a high risk intergenerationally, because we might well turn out to be the ones who are non-symptomatic but contagious. And I'm seeing that inability to conceptualize what it means to be in a community, and that interrelatedness. And as a matter of fact, in America, it's I'm sad to say, whether or not one is wearing their mask almost has nothing to do with the science. It's now become seen as a kind of a political statement. Is that amusing?
Well, it's amusing and tragic at the same time.
Yes, it is.
Makiz, we're rapidly running out of time now. So, Makiz, perhaps given we've covered so much of the Hismet, you might ask Bernadette about our last question that we have tucked away here.
Yes, just one quick one. Unfortunately, time is always a race against us, Bernadette. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience of the Anatolian culture, perhaps, and the food festival that started in 2009? And how did that go for you? Maybe we can finish it on that note.
There is that experience of beauty that brings you to tears. And you have that epiphany, a shared epiphany, that says, my goodness, this is the veracity of God's delight in the children of men. Because you saw the men, the women, the young people, these various cultures come together, doing the beautiful, beautiful cultural expressions. And it's just beyond words.
Bernadette Skubik, thank you so much for joining us on this Ramadan conversation. It's been a delight to meet you both.
It certainly
Pleasure
has.
is all ours.
And it's time now for a little music. And again, Amit is going to join us from all the way from Canada. Music there from Ahmed Gul. In Canada, we've been on the North American continent, but back to an Australian local now. Our final guest tonight is Professor Greg Barton, Professor of Global Islamic Politics at Alfred Deakin Institute, and Greg's been active for the past 30 years in interfaith dialogue initiatives and has a deep commitment to building understanding of Islam and of Muslim society. The central axis of Greg's research interests is the way in which religious thought in individual believers and communities respond to modernity and to the modern nation state. He also has a strong general interest in comparative international politics and has undertaken extensive research on Indonesian politics and society, especially on the role of Islam. And since 2004, he's made a comparative study of progressive Islamic thought in both Turkey and Indonesia. Greg Barton, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Thank you, John. Good to be with you.
Welcome,
Thank you,
Makiz,
Makiz,
perhaps
as well, I should say.
Makiz, you should open the batting for us.
Absolutely. Well, welcome and thanks for your time, Professor Barton. Now, my first question to you is, you've been working, as we just heard from John, in areas of interfaith and understanding at a political as well as cultural level for over 30 years now. And Australia's closest neighbours, Indonesia and Malaysia, are religiously majority Muslim communities. Now, over those years, has Australia been attentive enough to the nuances of these religious and cultural differences? How good are we at understanding our neighbours?
The short answer, Makiz, is not very good. The longer answer is that there are people who have engaged deeply, and this includes in business as well as academia and civil society, and who have a good understanding, I think. They unfortunately are the minority. Most people just haven't paid that much attention. We're living next door to the world's largest country and the most populous Muslim country, and yet we don't really understand Indonesia. We've had perhaps a bit more closer contact with Malaysia. Maybe that's partly language, partly the British sort of colonial past. But I don't think we in either country look at Islam and understand Islam particularly well. We sort of see it as a black box, not necessarily something that's bad, just something we don't understand. And so we don't understand the nuances. We don't understand the differences between the way a politician might reference religious ideas and the way in which community does. Of course, that's also true for Christianity in Western democracies, that we often just conflate things, and there's a gap between those who are religious and those who are, would see themselves as secular. But it's compounded when it comes to the Muslim world, and that includes our neighbours, unfortunately.
Greg, over the years, you've spent a lot of time looking at the sources of radicalisation amongst minority groups. Over that same time, we've witnessed a significant increase in our own Muslim population here in Australia. Do you think there was a failure, albeit a naive one, in our secular state in recognising how different many of the cultural and political background immigrant communities had been? Should we have provided a bit more thoughtful support?
Look, I think, John, we can always have done better, and it's tempting to be very critical of the Australian experience. But in general, I think it's important at times like this to recognise that Australian multiculturalism has done pretty well, and those who say that it's failed or that it needs to be revisited or dispensed with, I think are mistaken. I think a weakness of Australian approaches to multiculturalism is to neglect or fail to spend time thinking about religious matters and to think about the way in which religion and culture combine, at an individual level and at a community level. So that's a general weakness, and it is true that in the West we have an anxiety about Islam. We find it something that we don't understand and is different. And of course, since the rise of movements like Al-Qaeda, and particularly since the 9/11 attacks back in 2001, almost 19 years ago now, most of what we see on the evening news or the daily papers about Islam or Muslim societies is bad news, either about bad government or about extremist groups sometimes responding to those circumstances. I don't think the problem we've had with people being drawn more recently to Islamic State or other such groups in Australia is a failure of our multiculturalism or even a failure of our understanding of Muslim society. I think it's a failure to understand how these groups like Islamic State recruit, and they go looking for young people who feel lost and who are looking for friends, and they offer friendship, false friendship. They groom, they present themselves as being friends, and they offer a redemptive narrative. And that, frankly, is the same story with right-wing extremists as it is with religious extremists all around the world. And today in America, the number one problem is actually right-wing extremists. It's not just a Western problem. In India, we've got Hindu fundamentalist extremism, which in the Indian case demonizes Muslims. In Myanmar, we've seen what happened to the Rohingya Muslim population. You know, it's a complex story of people responding out of anxiety to something they don't understand and pushing back in fear, and then some groups particularly getting benefit from that. So if we had in Australia spent more time understanding Muslim communities and understanding Islam better, we'd be better positioned to help those young people and protect them from those who would come and try and steal them away. And I think that's something that people who work in this area recognize, and unfortunately it often gets conflated with security approaches and you know, sort of big brother state surveillance, which is, you know, not the way it's going to work. It's going to be effective.
Makiz.
Yes, indeed, quite complex situation. I guess you've already touched on some of what I'm about to ask Professor Barton. Now, during these Ramadan conversations, we've had a number of speakers actually come and talk about different current issues. One is the plight of Australian citizens, women and children, especially in the refugee camps of Syria, who are now threatened by COVID-19 lockdown. Now, most agree that in principle, we should bring our citizens home. And but as the government has put it, there are two constraints. And on one hand, there's the difficulty of access to those camps. And on the other, there's the possibility of the danger here at home if there has been no genuine renunciation of their perceived ideology. Now, other countries we know have been able to achieve repatriation. What is your view in this discussion?
It's a really interesting question, Makiz, and it's one that deals with tragic human suffering, not least because we've got young children involved, and you know we are worried about COVID-19 moving into those Syrian camps, particularly camps like the very large Ahol camp, where people live in squalid conditions, so there's no social distancing. I think the first thing to say is that this is a humanitarian concern as well as a security concern. It's a difficult problem. I don't know that it's classically a wicked problem in as much as I think there are solutions where there's a straightforward way of working that we can proceed along with some degree of confidence. The problem is more political will, and I think there are many people in the Australian federal government who recognise the plight of these women and children particularly, and would like to bring them home. And I think there's a smaller element that sees some political capital in taking a contrary view or taking a hardline view, or you know, perhaps there's genuine conviction. It's often hard to tell. But to sort of break it down, now that the Islamic State Caliphate has fallen, and the Syrian Democratic Forces have stable control over that northern third of Syria, north of the Euphrates River, where these camps are, there's reasonable stability. You know, you can go in there. Journalists have been going in, community members, Australians have been going in. I'm not saying that it's without any risk, but I don't think the risks are the prohibitive factor. The bigger problem, of course, is bringing home women and children, particularly teenagers, who may be sort of deeply traumatized, but also having strong radicalized convictions that may not easily be changed. That is tough, and it'll require a lot of resources. I often think it's important to make a utilitarian self-interest argument here. I'm concerned about the humanitarian issue. I think that should be a prime motivation, but I would also make the argument as a way of responding to sort of more hawkish opposition, that if we leave women and children in those camps, some of them will die an awful death, but mostly they'll live on, and they will very likely get caught up in Islamic State or some spin-off of it or some other radical group, and go on to lives that are not productive and maybe very destructive. And they will remember their link with Australia. And in this age of social media, they may never be able to physically return, but their presence will be destructive. We saw that with Neil Prakash from Melbourne, who became a sort of a pin-up boy for Islamic State, is now in a Turkish prison, but is likely to be released, and Australia has stripped him of his citizenship, so it's not likely he's coming back to Australia. But when if he is released from a Turkish prison, as is feared in the next couple of years, he will likely be back online and being a problem. So just from a self-interest point of view, the lesser of the evils, the lesser of the risks is to bring people home. They should face justice as adults or even as older children. They should certainly undergo programs of rehabilitation. If that's not effective, if it's not possible to turn them around from their convictions, then they should be safely detained. I'm not sort of, backing away from the challenges there. I think our national interest is better served by treating them humanely and decently, showing them justice, and hopefully in time seeing some rehabilitation, because if that happens, we'll learn a lot from what they have to tell us, and they can potentially help others, the next generation, from being caught up. If we take a short-sighted view, and I think this is a short-sighted view, and say they're not coming home, then in the medium to longer term, it's going to turn around and bite us. It's going to cost us. And not only will it be a humanitarian tragedy, it will undermine our national security. So I think that's a pretty robust argument when you break down the details, and I think that's a fairly widely shared view. The reason we're not acting on this is, and it's not just Australia, many other nations are doing exactly the same thing, is because it's hard. I would just say in conclusion, the reason many European and other Western nations don't act on this is because they're not sure of getting convictions, so people are brought back home. In Australia, our legislative framework makes it, I think, relatively straightforward. We've had areas like Raqqa province as a prescribed zone since October 2014 through to mid-2017. If those people were in that zone at that time, prosecution won't be so hard as it is, say, in the UK or Canada. So I think we should do it. I think we can do it. We may well do it. I fear for those women and children, particularly the children, and it has to be said that, very young children growing up in that environment are completely without blame. Older children maybe get caught up in the movement, and that's a concern. But we are dealing with people with a connection to Australia, Australian citizens, who need our compassion, but also our clear-minded reasoning about our own self-interest.
And just with regard to detention, we do have some experience in that with places like Christmas Island. So it's not as if we haven't thought that one through either. Greg, looking at the sad history of politics in the Middle East over the past 30 years and the contribution of the West perhaps to those events, we now see the economic collapse of Lebanon and the threat of COVID-19. How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the political realities post the pandemic, particularly in the face of economic dislocation and social breakdown, of the capacity for a resurgence of fundamentalist terrorism?
Look, I'm very concerned, John, not just about terrorism. I'm just concerned about the general political context, and that's what feeds terrorism, or that's what gives terrorism an opportunity space. When states really fail and go to pieces, think of Libya at the moment, and think of Syria during the civil war. That's when you can have a parasitic infestation by a group, and that's when it becomes really dangerous. Generally speaking, terrorism is not an existential threat, but at times in northern Nigeria or in Somalia or in Libya or Syria or Iraq during war, it becomes an existential threat. And all of the conditions that saw the rise of what was once Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Islamic State in Iraq, ISIS, Islamic State, whatever you want to call it today, or whatever it becomes in the future, all of those conditions are currently present. There's pretty disturbing news from Anbar province and from Nineveh province, where the city of Mosul is located around Mosul. These are, Iraq is a Shia majority country, but these are Sunni majority provinces, and summary justice, which to say not very good justice at all, dealt out to those suspected or even perhaps possibly having links with Islamic State, is sowing the seeds for the next generation of fighters. And already it's dropped out of our news because we're focused on COVID and the American elections and everything else, but there are dozens and dozens of attacks by what is now an Islamic State insurgency. There's no caliphate anymore, but there's a very active insurgency, and they terrorize towns and cities. They murder imams and mayors to send a lesson, and they literally know where everyone lives because they used to rule the place, and they're steadily rebuilding. If you want to see how this can play out. Think of Afghanistan and think of the Taliban. That's where we, are likely to go in the case of Iraq if things don't get better.
Greg, you mentioned Afghanistan there. Australia's been involved in the Afghan conflict as a US ally for many, many years. Is the current prospect of an Afghani settlement being helped or hindered by the United States approach, which seems geared as much to the US electoral cycle as it is to Afghani reality?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that when we went into Afghanistan, back at the end of 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, I think, by the way, the invasion of Iraq was a great mistake and there was no reason to do it. But there was a stronger reason for responding to Al-Qaeda working out of Afghanistan, striking with those attacks. But we didn't have a plan. We had never had a strategic vision. Every component member of the coalition had short-term plans, and they sort of demarcate areas of work to do, but the overarching plan. And as a result, we haven't made the progress we were hoping to make. We've wasted a lot of money. There's been a lot of loss of lives, not least Afghani lives, but as well as international coalition members, service people. And it's tragic that there's been all of that suffering without the sort of the long-term gain. It's not surprising that in this election year in America that Trump has always taken this line of not just America first, but America alone, wants to retreat from the world, wants to withdraw from responsibility. It was always going to be the case that this longest war, people would say it's gone on too long, it should end. And that, of course, it's not surprising that President Trump would want to pull troops out. But that impetus to just look for a short way to the exit is, I think, potentially going to have very tragic consequences. We saw this with an attempt to pull out special forces, small numbers of US troops from northern Syria, where the Syrian Democratic Forces are fighting for their life. And now we see it in Afghanistan, and of course other coalition partners are likely to follow. After all these years, many mistakes, many tragic sufferings, loss of life, it doesn't make any sense to compound all that by just cutting and running. I don't think this so-called peace deal with the Taliban in its current form is going to hold. It's going to be productive. And if that's the case, we need to stay the distance and hold the Taliban to account. Otherwise, we're just walking away from everything we've invested in, and everyone suffers. It's the worst possible outcome.
Makiz.
Yes, it is the worst possible outcome, actually, Professor Greg Barton. I guess this brings us to the final question. You have shared many iftars over the years. How important is the multi-faith component of these gatherings for building a better future and a better Australia?
It's a good question, Makiz. It's it'd be easy to give some answer that says it solves all the problems. Of course, it doesn't, but it's an important contribution. It's one of those many things that we need to be doing. And I think sometimes we need to stop without sort of resting on our laurels. At least things have worked and these things are good and we should celebrate it. As I said, Australian multiculturalism hasn't failed. It can and should be better, but let's not give up on it. And let's not give up on interfaith initiatives either. One of the great things about something like these public communal iftars, I know in Muslim majority countries, iftars are communal feasts. Sadly, with COVID-19, everyone is suffering as a result of not being able to meet, not just with family and friends, but with communities. But the really pioneering thing in Australia was 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, 2001, before the attacks. People came together and said, let's have communal iftars, but not just for our own Muslim brothers and sisters. Let's try and invite some of the others along. And over time, they invited Christians, Jews, Sikhs, police, people from the Ambulance Association, all sorts of people came along, people who ordinarily probably didn't have a lot of time or pathways into interfaith gatherings. And I think what they found was sitting down at a table, talking with somebody, enjoying their company, enjoying hospitality, enjoying the program. But these are people like us. These are interesting people. They're nice people. They're accessible. Maybe they dress differently, or we never had a chance to talk. But now that we have talked, we should talk more often. I think that breaking the ice and building confidence has been really productive, and there's a lot more to do. But it's been one of those success stories, particularly in Australia, and it has been something that's been pioneered in Melbourne and Sydney, and then other cities beyond. And I think we should stop and say, well, that's something that's been working well. Let's see what else we can do on the same frame.
Greg Barton, thank you so much for joining us today. Professor Greg Barton, one of Australia's great thinkers on some of the most pressing issues we face as a country. It's been great to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Makiz. Thanks, John.
Well, Makiz, what a ride that's been. What a program. Thanks for your part, being part of the team. I hope we can catch up again soon.
I hope so too, but it's been a joy sharing these two programs with you, John. Thank you for having me.
And thank you all at home or wherever you happen to be listening and watching this Ramadan conversation from. Make sure to tune in to our next episode tomorrow as we fly off to Adelaide and have a special didgeridoo performance from Affinity's new advisory board member, Wallangari Kantawari. Over the past week, our conversations have featured a number of well-known guests, and if you wish to view this or any of this series of Ramadan Conversations, you can find them on the Affinity YouTube channel. Stay safe. Have a blessed Ramadan.